Another large drug bust, this time involving hundreds of pounds of meth.
Wiretaps, undercover operations, extensive surveillance, and swift enforcement action led to enormous seizures in this case.
In the early hours before dawn, Minneapolis remained quiet. At 4:41 a.m., federal agents executed a coordinated operation targeting a residential property that had been under investigation for months. There were no sirens or visible police lights. Unmarked federal vehicles arrived simultaneously at multiple access points. Agents secured the perimeter and initiated entry after confirming internal positioning. This was not a routine narcotics warrant. The investigation had begun as a financial and immigration fraud inquiry. Over time, surveillance data, financial tracking, and interagency coordination indicated a broader criminal structure operating beyond document falsification. The case escalated after patterns suggested trafficking indicators and high-volume drug distribution. Upon entry, agents cleared the structure room by room. In the main living area, they located vacuum-sealed packages of methamphetamine in quantities consistent with large-scale distribution. The volume suggested supply beyond city-level circulation. In the kitchen area, behind a concealed wall cavity, investigators discovered forged identification documents, passports, and bundled currency. The documentation pointed toward coordinated identity fraud and cross-state movement of individuals. The operation shifted in tone when agents identified structural inconsistencies in the flooring leading to a concealed access point. A hidden stairwell led to a basement compartment. There, agents discovered 32 minors confined within a secured enclosure. The children showed visible signs of prolonged isolation and neglect. Emergency medical and child protection units were immediately requested to the scene. At that moment, the investigation moved beyond narcotics and fraud. It became a trafficking case with potential links to organized criminal coordination. The scale of the findings indicated that the residence functioned as a node within a broader network, rather than an isolated operation. Authorities began processing evidence on site while forensic teams documented the structure, materials, and digital devices recovered. The immediate priority shifted to victim identification, medical stabilization, and tracing the network's operational footprint. This was no longer a localized enforcement action. It was the opening stage of a much larger federal investigation. The discovery of the 32 minors fundamentally changed the scope of the operation. What began as a narcotics and fraud investigation was formally reclassified as a multi-layer trafficking case. Child protection services and federal trafficking specialists were brought in immediately. Victim identification and medical assessment became the priority. During the continued search of the property, agents located additional hidden compartments containing firearms. AR-15-style rifles and multiple handguns were recovered. Several weapons had defaced or removed serial numbers. The condition of the firearms suggested they were maintained for distribution or operational use. This indicated coordination beyond simple possession. Investigators documented large quantities of currency stored in concealed wall cavities. Financial analysts later linked portions of the cash flow to fraudulent asylum filings, identity document manipulation, and structured bank deposits designed to avoid reporting thresholds. According to case documents, the residence functioned as a logistical node. It was not merely a storage site, but part of a broader operational chain involving document fraud, narcotics movement, and trafficking facilitation. Authorities also recovered approximately 9,700 pounds of methamphetamine packaged for wholesale distribution. The quantity exceeded typical regional supply levels and suggested interstate or cross-border coordination. Digital devices seized on site are now under forensic review. Early analysis reportedly indicates encrypted communications and structured payment routing. During the enforcement phase, the primary target attempted to leave the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport via private aviation. Federal agents intercepted and detained the individual prior to departure. Charges are expected to include narcotics distribution, firearms violations, trafficking offenses, and fraud-related counts pending formal indictment. At this stage, the focus has shifted from the single property to network mapping. Federal authorities are working to identify financial facilitators, document processors, transportation intermediaries, and additional holding locations. The case is now being treated as a coordinated criminal enterprise investigation rather than an isolated incident. What remains unclear is the total geographic footprint of the network and how long it operated before detection. For now, the property in Minneapolis represents the first confirmed operational site in what may become a broader federal case. The investigation is ongoing. As agents continued processing the property, investigators uncovered thousands of physical documents. These included forged immigration records, fraudulent asylum filings, identity templates, and structured applicant lists. The volume suggested systematic processing rather than isolated falsification. Each file appeared to follow similar formatting patterns, indicating centralized coordination. Forensic analysts began cataloging repeated sponsor addresses, recycled contact information, duplicated financial affidavits, and identical supporting narratives across multiple applications. The emerging picture pointed to a structured fraud model built around exploiting procedural vulnerabilities in the asylum review process. According to preliminary findings, the residence functioned as a documentation hub within a larger enterprise. It was not limited to narcotics and weapons distribution. It also facilitated identity laundering and immigration status manipulation. Investigators are now reviewing approval records connected to the primary suspect. Authorities have indicated that tens of thousands of applications may require re-examination, pending verification of procedural irregularities. Financial tracing has identified layered payment routing through shell entities and offshore holding structures. Analysts are working to determine whether those transfers correspond directly to specific application approvals or broader trafficking revenue streams. During the enforcement phase, agents confirmed that the primary target was not present at the residence. Shortly thereafter, federal authorities tracked the individual to Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport. Surveillance coordination and flight monitoring allowed agents to intercept the subject in the private aviation terminal prior to departure. The detention was executed without incident. With the arrest secured, the investigation transitioned into its next phase: enterprise mapping. Authorities are now focused on identifying document preparers, financial intermediaries, transportation coordinators, and additional holding or processing locations. Early estimates suggest that the scale of the alleged fraud may involve tens of thousands of reviewed cases and potentially significant financial exposure. However, officials have cautioned that these figures remain under forensic verification. The broader implications extend beyond a single arrest. If confirmed, the case could prompt procedural audits, enhanced review standards, and structural safeguards designed to prevent similar exploitation in the future. At this stage, investigators emphasize that the inquiry remains active. Digital evidence, financial records, and cross-agency data matching will determine the full operational footprint of the network. The arrest closed one chapter. The structural investigation has only begun. During evidence processing, federal agents confirmed the seizure of approximately 9,700 pounds of methamphetamine. Investigators believe the volume was consistent with multi-state wholesale distribution rather than localized sales. Authorities are now analyzing supply routes, transport records, and financial transfers connected to the seized narcotics. The quantity suggests that the property was one component of a broader distribution infrastructure. Firearms recovered during the operation are undergoing ballistic testing. Federal forensic units are comparing serial restoration data and ballistic signatures against national crime databases to determine whether any of the weapons are connected to previously unsolved cases. At this stage, investigators have not publicly confirmed specific case matches, but the review remains ongoing. As the case developed, the scope expanded beyond narcotics and document fraud into enterprise-level criminal coordination. Officials began evaluating procedural safeguards related to asylum documentation, financial oversight, and interagency verification processes. Following the arrest and subsequent prosecution of the primary defendant, federal court proceedings resulted in a 28-year sentence. Additional individuals identified through financial tracing and communication analysis were later charged in related indictments. Authorities emphasized that the case reflects the exploitation of procedural gaps rather than the failure of the legal framework itself. In response, administrative adjustments were introduced to strengthen document verification standards, improve cross-agency data sharing, and enhance fraud detection mechanisms. These measures include expanded background verification protocols, improved digital cross-referencing of applicant data, increased auditing of approval patterns, and strengthened financial monitoring triggers. The reforms were procedural in nature and aimed at reducing vulnerability to coordinated fraud schemes. Investigators continue to assess the total operational footprint of the enterprise, including additional properties, facilitators, and financial conduits. Digital forensic analysis remains active. What began as a targeted enforcement action in Minneapolis evolved into a multi-layer federal case involving narcotics distribution, trafficking, firearms violations, and structured documentation fraud. The full scope of the network is still under review. The enforcement phase concluded with arrests and seizures. The structural analysis phase continues. At the center of the case was Judge Layla Maid, accused of approving large volumes of fraudulent asylum applications in exchange for financial compensation. According to federal filings, the approvals were not isolated irregularities, but part of a coordinated pattern. Investigators allege that fraudulent documentation, staged narratives, and manipulated eligibility records were systematically processed over an extended period. The operation extended beyond a single official. Financial tracing, communication logs, and document analysis identified additional facilitators operating across multiple states. These included document preparers, financial intermediaries, and logistical coordinators connected to narcotics distribution and trafficking activities. The case also revealed the human impact of the enterprise. Among the most significant findings were minors held in unlawful confinement, now placed under protective supervision and medical evaluation. Following the arrest and prosecution of the primary defendant, federal authorities initiated broader compliance reviews. These reviews focused on anomaly detection and approval rates, cross-verification of applicant documentation, enhanced financial disclosure monitoring, improved data sharing between agencies. Administrative updates were introduced to strengthen oversight mechanisms and reduce exposure to coordinated fraud schemes. Law enforcement agencies also began reviewing additional cases flagged through pattern analysis. Several related investigations were opened based on shared documentation signatures and financial routing similarities. Officials emphasized that reforms were procedural adjustments designed to address vulnerabilities identified during the investigation. The long-term implications remain under review. Applications previously approved under questionable documentation are being re-examined through established legal channels. Each case is subject to individual assessment under existing statutory guidelines. The Minneapolis operation began as a targeted enforcement action. It evolved into a multi-state investigation involving narcotics distribution, firearms violations, trafficking offenses, and structured documentation fraud. The prosecution of one individual marked a major milestone. The broader institutional review process continues. The coordinated actions of federal law enforcement agencies marked a significant step in dismantling what investigators describe as a structured criminal enterprise. Authorities emphasized that the operation required months of interagency collaboration, financial analysis, digital forensics, and coordinated enforcement planning. The case illustrated how organized criminal networks can operate within legitimate administrative frameworks, exploiting procedural gaps while maintaining outward legitimacy. Investigators noted that such enterprises are rarely visible at the surface level. They rely on layered structures, compartmentalized roles, and strategic use of authority positions to minimize detection risk. The arrest of Judge Layla Maid represented a critical enforcement milestone. However, officials have made clear that the broader investigation remains active. Enterprise-level cases of this scale often extend beyond a single defendant, requiring ongoing review of financial conduits, documentation channels, and associated facilitators. Administrative reviews and compliance adjustments are now underway to strengthen oversight mechanisms and reduce structural vulnerabilities identified during the investigation. At this stage, several questions remain under evaluation. What was the full geographic footprint of the network? How long did operational activity continue before detection? And what long-term procedural adjustments will prove most effective in preventing similar schemes? The Minneapolis operation began as a targeted enforcement action. It evolved into a multi-layer federal case involving narcotics distribution, trafficking, firearms violations, and documentation fraud. The enforcement phase has concluded. The structural review continues. If you found this breakdown useful, consider subscribing to State Tone for more clear, structured analysis of complex federal investigations. Like the video if you value fact-based reporting, and share your perspective in the comments below.